I've lived long enough to know that some people don't disappear. They're taken piece by piece until there's nothing left to recognize. Before we begin, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. I am 93 years old now, and I've learned something about evil that most people never understand. Real evil doesn't announce itself with thunder and lightning. It doesn't wear a mask or carry a weapon. Sometimes it just knocks on your door with a smile, asks to use your phone, and by the time you notice what's missing from your kitchen, it's already too late. What I'm about to tell you are 3 stories from my life in Nevada. 3 people I knew. 3 nightmares that began in the desert and never truly ended. These aren't legends or folk tales. These are real people with real names who made a wrong turn, trusted the wrong stranger, or stayed in the wrong place a little too long. The first story is about my neighbor, Patricia Hewell. I met Patricia in 1979 when I moved to a small housing tract just outside Reno. She lived 3 houses down from me, early 40s, quiet, blonde hair, already going gray. The kind of woman who did her yard work early in the morning before the heat settled in. She was friendly, but kept to herself. In small desert communities, that kind of quiet familiarity matters. Poor Patricia's husband had left her years earlier, and both of her sons had moved to California for work. She lived alone in a modest ranch house with yellow shutters and a barn-shaped mailbox. Even though she didn't show it much, I could tell the loneliness had worn on her. Patricia worked from home as a medical transcriptionist, which meant she spent most of her days inside, typing up doctors' notes and hospital reports. But every evening around 6 o'clock, without fail, she went for the same walk. She was remarkably fit and energetic for her age. Every day she walked down Sagebrush Road, looped around the vacant lot on the corner, and came back the same way. The walk always took 30 minutes. She passed by at the same time, and she never changed her route. Honestly, her punctuality was incredible. I would see her from my porch and wave. She would nod politely, but never stop to talk. That was Patricia, predictable, reserved, and perfectly content with her solitary routine. Until the summer of 1982. It started with small things. Patricia began missing her evening walks. I noticed because I was used to seeing her pass my house every evening at 6:15. And suddenly, she just wasn't there. At first, I thought she might be sick or had changed her schedule. But then one afternoon, I saw her standing in her yard beside her roses, completely still, staring down at the ground. I called over to her. "Patricia, everything okay?" She looked up slowly, and I'll never forget the expression on her face. Blank, like she didn't recognize me, even though we'd been neighbors for 3 years. I'm sorry, she said finally. Do I know you? I laughed nervously. It's Margaret, from number 42. She blinked a few times, then smiled, a strange, mechanical smile. Of course. Margaret, I'm sorry. I've been distracted. I asked if she needed anything, but she just shook her head and went back inside. Over the next few weeks, Patricia's behavior grew stranger. She stopped answering her door. Her mail piled up in the yellow barn mailbox. The roses she used to tend every morning withered and died. And late at night, I would hear her voice through the open windows, not talking on the phone, not watching television, but counting backwards. 97, 96, 95. At first, I thought she was doing some kind of meditation or stress relief exercise. But the counting went on for hours. Sometimes I'd hear it at 2 a.m., sometimes at dawn. Always the same slow, deliberate countdown. 73, 72, 71. One evening, I decided to check on her. I knocked on her door. No answer. I knocked again, louder. Finally, the door opened just a crack, and Patricia peered out through the gap. She looked terrible. Her hair was unwashed, her eyes sunken and ringed with dark circles. Margaret, she said quietly, you shouldn't be here. Patricia, I'm worried about you. Are you okay? Do you need help? She stared at me for a long moment, then whispered, I met someone. That's wonderful, I said, trying to sound encouraging. Who is he? Her expression didn't change. He comes every night. He tells me things, important things. What kind of things? She leaned closer, her breath stale and sour. He says I have 97 days left, so I'm counting them down. I need to know when it's coming. My stomach twisted. Patricia, that's not 68, she interrupted. I'm on 68 now. She closed the door before I could say anything else. I didn't know what to do. I called her sons in California, but neither answered. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? My neighbor is counting backwards. They'd think I was the crazy one. So I did what I should have done from the start. I watched. And that's when I saw him. Before I tell you what I saw that night, comment below. Would you have gone outside? Or stayed hidden like I did? 3 nights later, around 11 p.m., I was sitting in my living room with the lights off, looking out the window toward Patricia's house. A car pulled up, a dark sedan, unremarkable. No license plate visible from my angle. A man got out. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing a long coat despite the summer heat. His hair was dark, slicked back, and even from a distance, there was something wrong about the way he moved. Too smooth, too deliberate. Like every step was calculated. He walked up to Patricia's door and knocked once. She opened it immediately, as if she'd been waiting. He stepped inside without a word, and the door closed behind him. I sat there, frozen, my heart pounding. Should I call someone? Should I go over there? I stayed where I was, and I've regretted it ever since. The man stayed for exactly 1 hour. When he left, he didn't look around, didn't check if anyone was watching. He just got in his car and drove away. The next morning, I went to Patricia's house. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open and called her name. Patricia? No answer. I stepped inside. The house was cold despite the desert heat, and it smelled wrong, like old copper and something chemical. The living room was tidy, almost unnaturally so. No dishes in the sink, no clutter on the tables, but on the wall above the couch, written in black marker, were numbers. They went all the way down to the floor, covering the entire wall in neat, obsessive rows. Hundreds of numbers, descending in perfect order. And at the bottom, in larger letters, he knows when I found Patricia in her bedroom. She was sitting on the floor beside her bed, her back against the wall, staring straight ahead. She wasn't dead, but she wasn't really alive either. Her eyes were open but empty, and her lips moved silently, forming the same words over and over. 41, 39. I called 911. When the paramedics arrived, they couldn't get her to respond. They took her to the hospital, where she stayed for 3 days under psychiatric observation. The doctors said she was in a dissociative state, likely caused by extreme stress or trauma. But they couldn't find any physical injuries, no drugs in her system, no signs of abuse. She just broke. When they released her, her sons came to take her back to California. I never saw Patricia again, but I heard from one of her sons a few years later that she never recovered. She still counts every day, and she's still waiting for the number to reach 0. The police investigated, of course. They found no evidence of forced entry, no fingerprints that didn't belong to Patricia, no sign of the man I'd seen that night. They searched her house top to bottom and found nothing except those numbers on the wall. But here's the part that keeps me awake at night. When they analyzed the marker used to write those numbers, they found something strange. The ink contained traces of Patricia's own blood, mixed in so faintly that it took a forensic lab to detect it. Someone had been making her write those numbers with her own blood. I don't know who that man was. I don't know what he did to Patricia or why he chose her. But I know this: evil doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it just teaches you to count the days until there's nothing left to count. Patricia is still alive, somewhere in a care facility in Los Angeles. And somewhere out there, that man is still driving his dark sedan, still knocking on doors, still teaching people to count backwards. Because once you start counting, you can't stop. And when you reach 0, he comes back to collect. And that was only the first nightmare. If you think the desert can't get worse, you haven't seen what it does to the people who try to map it. Some places don't just exist on maps. They exist because of them. And sometimes the person drawing the map knows exactly where you're going to end up. The second story I need to tell you is about a man named Gerald Moss. I didn't know him very well, but his daughter Claire was a close friend of mine. I met Claire in a sewing circle in Carson City in 1987. And over the years, we became the kind of friends who shared everything: recipes, gossip, fears, and eventually the truth about what happened to her father. Gerald Moss was a cartographer, not the kind who works for Google or GPS companies today. This was the 1980s, when maps were still drawn by hand, when wild areas were charted step by step, and a man could disappear into the Nevada desert for weeks with a compass and a notebook, and no one would think twice about it. Gerald had spent 30 years mapping remote parts of Nevada for the Bureau of Land Management. He was meticulous about accuracy, almost obsessive. He was truly an idealist. He devoted far more time to his work than most people ever would. Claire used to joke that her father loved maps more than people, and honestly, that wasn't far from the truth. There's always a little truth beneath a joke. Gerald kept every map he ever drew in a special fireproof cabinet in his study. Hundreds of maps. Some were official government surveys. Others were personal projects, areas he explored simply because they fascinated him. In the spring of 1989, Gerald retired. He was 62, in good health, and looking forward to spending his days hiking, fishing, and finishing a massive personal project he'd been working on for more than a decade. A complete topographic map of the Black Rock Desert region, including areas that had never been officially surveyed. He had the excitement of a young man. If you saw Gerald, you wouldn't think he was 62. You'd think he was in his 20s. Claire was thrilled for her father. He had worked himself to the bone for years, and she believed retirement would finally give him the peace he deserved. She helped him move into a small house on the outskirts of Winnemucca. It was quiet, had a wide backyard, a garage he could turn into a proper workspace, and most importantly, easy access to the desert he loved so much. Everything seemed perfect. For the first few months, Gerald was happy. He'd wake early, make coffee, and spend hours in his garage working on his maps. He'd take weekend trips into the desert with his surveying equipment, coming back sunburned and covered in dust, but grinning like a kid. Claire visited him often, and every time he'd show her his progress. New elevations marked, new trails documented, new details added to his masterwork. But sometime in late August, things changed. Claire noticed it first during a Sunday visit. Gerald seemed distracted, almost agitated. He kept glancing toward the garage, and when she asked to see his latest work, he hesitated, something he'd never done before. "Not yet," he said. "It's not ready." "Dad, I've been looking at your maps since I was 5 years old. When have you ever cared if they were ready? He forced a smile. This one's different. I need to get it exactly right. She let it go. But over the next few weeks, Gerald stopped answering her calls. When she drove out to check on him, he'd open the door just a crack, assure her he was fine, and send her away. His appearance deteriorated. He lost weight, his eyes grew bloodshot, and his hands trembled constantly. Finally, in early October, Claire demanded to come inside. Gerald reluctantly agreed. The house was a disaster. Dishes piled in the sink, mail unopened on the counter. But the real shock was the garage. Every wall was covered in maps. Not neat, organized maps like Gerald usually made, but obsessive, overlapping layers of paper, taped, pinned, stapled to every available surface. Some were old maps he'd drawn years ago. Others were new, drawn in frantic, shaky lines. And in the center of it all, spread across a massive table, was the map, his Black Rock Desert Project. But it wasn't like any map Claire had ever seen. It showed roads that didn't exist, towns with names she'd never heard of, elevation markers that made no geological sense. And strangest of all, there were notes scribbled in the margins in handwriting that didn't look like her father's. Cramped, spidery text that read like instructions. Turn at the 3 stones. Follow the sound of wind through metal. Do not stop at the house with red shutters. He's waiting at mile marker 14. Claire stared at her father. What is this? Gerald didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the map. It's the real desert, he whispered. The one underneath. The one people drive through without seeing. Dad, I don't understand. There's another layer, he interrupted, his voice rising. Beneath the roads we know. Beneath the towns. Beneath everything. And he showed it to me. Who showed you? Gerald finally turned to face her, and what she saw in his eyes made her stomach drop. Fear. Pure animal fear. The man I met out there. The surveyor. Claire's hands went cold. What surveyor? You work alone. I thought I did. Gerald walked to the table and picked up a small, yellowed photograph. He handed it to Claire. The photo showed a man standing in the desert. Tall, thin, wearing old-fashioned clothing from maybe the 1920s or 1930s. He held surveying equipment, and behind him, the landscape looked wrong. The shadows fell at impossible angles. The rocks seemed to bend. I found him at an old survey marker near the playa, Gerald said. Just standing there, middle of nowhere, no car, no camp. I thought maybe he was lost, so I approached him. He said he'd been mapping the area for a long time. Said there were things out there that didn't make it onto official maps. Things people needed to know about. Dad, this is... He gave me coordinates, Gerald continued, not listening. Told me to go to specific locations at specific times. Said I'd understand once I saw them. So I went. And? Gerald's hands shook as he spread them across the map. I saw roads that disappeared when I tried to drive on them. I saw buildings that flickered in and out of existence. I saw mile markers that counted backwards. And I saw people, Claire, people standing by the roadside, watching me pass. Same people, every location, same faces, never moving, just standing there. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. Dad, I think you need to see a doctor. I'm not crazy, Gerald shouted, slamming his hand on the table. I documented everything. Coordinates, times, photographs. He grabbed a stack of Polaroids and thrust them at her. Claire looked through them. Most showed empty desert, nothing unusual. But a few made her pause. One photo showed a dirt road stretching into the distance. Standing at the side of the road, barely visible in the heat haze, was a figure. Dark clothing, perfectly still. Another showed an old gas station that Claire knew had been demolished in the 1970s. But in Gerald's photo, it looked brand new, lights on as if it had never closed. And the last photo, the one that made Claire's blood run cold, showed the interior of Gerald's garage, taken from an angle that would have required the camera to be mounted on the ceiling. But Gerald had never installed any cameras. In the photo, Gerald was asleep at his table, head down on the map. And standing in the doorway behind him, barely visible in the shadows, was a tall, thin figure in old-fashioned clothing. The surveyor. Claire dropped the photos. Dad, we need to leave, right now. But Gerald just shook his head. It's too late. I went back. I found him again, and I asked him why he was showing me these things. Do you know what he said? Claire didn't want to know, but Gerald told her anyway. He said, because now you're part of the map, and the map needs to be complete. That was the last real conversation Claire had with her father. The next day, she convinced Gerald to check himself into a hospital in Reno for psychiatric evaluation. The doctors diagnosed him with acute paranoid delusions and put him on medication. He stayed for 2 weeks, and when he was released, he seemed better, calmer, more lucid. He even apologized to Claire for scaring her. I was working too hard, he said, spending too much time alone. The isolation got to me. Claire wanted to believe him. She helped him pack up the garage, throwing away most of the chaotic maps. She convinced him to move closer to town, to a small apartment where he'd have neighbors and regular social contact. For 3 months, Gerald seemed fine. Then, in January of 1990, he disappeared. Claire went to his apartment for their weekly lunch and found the door unlocked. Gerald was gone. No note, no packed bags, no signs of struggle. But on his kitchen table, there was a map. A simple, hand-drawn map showing a route from Winnemucca into the Black Rock Desert. And at the end of the route, marked with a red X, were the words, Final Survey Point. The police searched for Gerald for weeks. They followed the route on his map, but it led to an empty stretch of desert with nothing but rocks and sagebrush. No Gerald, no body, no evidence he'd ever been there. Claire never stopped looking. For years, she drove out to the desert on weekends, following her father's maps, searching for any sign of him. She never found anything. But here's what she did find, and this is what haunts me most. In 2003, 13 years after Gerald disappeared, a highway crew was repaving a section of Route 447 near Gerlach. One of the workers noticed something strange: old surveying markers embedded in the ground, the kind used decades ago, but in locations that didn't match any known survey. When they dug one up to remove it, they found something attached underneath: a rusted metal box. Inside was a journal. Some discoveries are meant to stay buried. Like this video, if you agree. Curiosity is dangerous in the desert. The journal belonged to a surveyor named Thomas Wickham, who had worked in the region in 1934. The final entry, dated October 12, 1934, read, "I have seen the hidden roads. I have walked the paths beneath the desert. I know now that some places are not meant to be mapped because they do not exist until someone draws them. The man who taught me this says there is always room for one more surveyor. I believe him. I'm going to meet him at the final point tonight. If you are reading this, then I have joined the map. Do not follow. Do not look for the markers. Let the desert keep its secrets." Below that, in different handwriting, fresher ink, modern pen, was a second note. Gerald Moss, January 18th, 1990. I understand now. Claire showed me that journal before she died last year. I held it in my hands and read those words over and over, and I still don't know what to believe. Did Gerald find something real out there in the desert? Or did isolation and obsession create a delusion so powerful that it consumed him? I don't have answers, but I know this. There are places in Nevada where your GPS stops working, where roads on your map don't match the roads you're driving, where you can follow directions perfectly and still end up somewhere you've never heard of. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm driving through empty desert and I see a figure standing by the roadside, I don't stop. I don't slow down. I just keep driving. Because some maps are drawn by people who never came back. And once you're on their map, you become part of the legend they're still trying to finish. Some sounds were never meant to be heard twice, and some sounds belong to people who stopped speaking years ago. The third and final story I need to tell you is about a man named Dennis Kowalski. I met Dennis in 1993 through my church group in Fallon, Nevada. He was a sound engineer, one of those technical, detail-oriented people who could tell you the difference between microphones you've never even heard of, and who spent his weekends relaxing by recording natural soundscapes. He was intelligent and knew things I'd never even heard of before. Dennis was 41 years old, married to a woman named Linda, and they had consciously chosen not to have children. They seemed happy, the kind of couple who finished each other's sentences and genuinely enjoyed spending time together. Sometimes I envied them. Even though I found their decision not to have children a little unusual, I could tell their chemistry might have been stronger than most couples because of it. Anyway, I'm getting off track. Dennis worked from home, mixing audio for commercials and small radio stations, while Linda was an elementary school teacher. In the summer of 1994, Dennis became interested in a local legend about Silver Lake, a dried lake bed about 30 miles northwest of Fallon. He was already the type who loved reading and researching. The lake had once been a real body of water in the 1950s, but by the 1970s, it had completely evaporated, leaving behind miles of flat, cracked, white alkali dust. According to the legend, if you stood in the exact center of the old lake bed at midnight, you could hear voices from the past, conversations echoing across the empty basin, as if the dried earth were replaying recordings of everyone who had ever stood there. Dennis thought that was nonsense. But as a sound engineer, the idea of natural acoustic phenomena fascinated him. Maybe the flat surface created unusual echoes. Maybe wind patterns produced sounds people interpreted as voices. He wanted to investigate it scientifically, record whatever was out there, and analyze it properly. Linda thought it was a waste of time, but she knew Dennis well enough to understand he would obsess over it until he satisfied his curiosity. So one Saturday night in late July, she agreed to go with him. They set out for Silver Lake round 11 o'clock, when the desert was finally beginning to cool from the brutal summer heat. Dennis brought his professional recording equipment, a high-quality portable recorder, directional microphones, headphones, and spare batteries. He had done this kind of field recording dozens of times before. The lake bed was exactly as described, a vast, flat expanse of cracked white earth that seemed to glow faintly under the moonlight. No vegetation, no animals, no sound at all except the occasional whisper of wind. Dennis consulted the topographical map he'd brought and calculated the approximate center of the old lake. They walked for about 15 minutes, their footsteps crunching loudly on the dried surface, until Dennis was satisfied they'd reached the right spot. He set up his equipment, placed microphones in different directions, put on his headphones, and waited. For the first 20 minutes, nothing happened. Just silence and the occasional gust of wind. Linda sat on a folding chair Dennis had brought, reading a book by flashlight and swatting at mosquitoes. Then, at exactly midnight, Dennis heard it. A voice, distant and faint, but unmistakably human. A man's voice, speaking conversationally, as if talking to someone nearby. Dennis immediately checked his equipment. No interference, no radio signals. The voice was coming from the environment itself. He adjusted his microphones, trying to get a clearer recording. The voice continued, joined by a second voice, a woman's. They seemed to be having a casual conversation, though Dennis couldn't make out specific words. The voices would fade in and out, like a radio station with poor reception. Linda noticed Dennis's intense focus. "What is it?" "Shh," Dennis whispered, not taking off his headphones. "I'm hearing something." He recorded for another 10 minutes, during which he counted at least 4 distinct voices. 2 men, 2 women, all speaking in overlapping fragments. Sometimes they seemed to be laughing. Other times, the tone sounded urgent, almost argumentative. Then, abruptly, all the voices stopped. Dennis waited another hour, but the phenomenon didn't repeat. Finally, around 1:30 a.m., they packed up and drove home, Dennis buzzing with excitement about what he'd captured. The next morning, Dennis locked himself in his home studio to analyze the recordings. Linda went to run errands, expecting Dennis to be finished by the time she returned. She came back 6 hours later to find Dennis still at his computer, headphones on, staring at the audio waveforms on his screen with an expression she'd never seen before. Not excitement, not confusion, but fear. "Dennis, you okay?" He pulled off his headphones slowly. "Linda, sit down. You need to hear this." He played the recording for her. At first, it sounded like what Dennis had described. Distant, overlapping voices, indistinct, but clearly human. But then, Dennis isolated one voice using his audio software, filtering out the others, amplifying and cleaning up the signal. The voice became crystal clear. It was a man, probably in his 30s, speaking casually. "So I told him we should meet at the lake instead. You know, more private. Nobody goes out there anymore since it dried up." Another voice, younger, replied, "Makes sense. What time?" "Midnight, Saturday. Tell the others." Dennis stopped the playback. "Okay, so that's weird, but not impossible. Maybe sound carried from somewhere miles away, some acoustic trick. But listen to this part." He played another segment. A woman's voice, clearer than the others. "Beautiful out here, isn't it? Hard to believe this used to be full of water. My parents brought me here when I was 6. We went fishing right where we're standing now." A man's voice responded, "That was what, 30 years ago?" 32, 1962. I was 6 years old, which makes this 1994. Linda's eyes widened. "That's this year." "Exactly." Dennis's hands were shaking. "These aren't echoes from the past. These are current conversations. If this revelation just gave you chills, press like, because it gets far more disturbing. But here's the problem. We were the only people out there. I walked the entire visible area before we started recording. There was nobody else. Maybe they were on the far edges, beyond where you could see." Dennis shook his head. "I checked the acoustics when I was setting up. Sound doesn't travel that clearly across open desert. These voices sound like they're coming from within 100 feet, but there was nobody there. Over the next week, Dennis became obsessed with the recording. He enhanced every fragment, isolated every voice, and made a disturbing discovery. He could identify 7 distinct speakers, 3 men, 4 women, different ages, different accents, and every single one of them mentioned being at Silver Lake on specific dates. Dates that spanned from 1962 to 1994. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part was what they talked about. Dennis played me some of the clips when I visited their house 2 weeks later. He'd invited several people from our church group, wanting witnesses to what he'd found. We sat in his studio while he played segment after segment. One voice, an older man. Buried it about 50 feet north of the center point. Nobody's ever going to find it. This lake's been dead for 20 years. A younger woman. I still see her face sometimes, standing right where we're standing now. Before she went into the water, a middle-aged man. The police never found the car. Probably still down there somewhere, under all that dried mud and salt. We listened in growing unease. Every voice seemed to be confessing something, admitting to something they'd done at Silver Lake when it was still full of water or shortly after it dried up. But here's what made it truly terrifying. Dennis had done research on Silver Lake's history. In 1963, a young woman named Patricia Reardon had drowned there. Her death was ruled accidental, but her family always suspected foul play. Her body was recovered, but the case was never solved. In 1971, a car belonging to a man named Robert Chen disappeared. He was last seen near Silver Lake. Neither he nor his vehicle were ever found. In 1979, a couple camping at the lake reported that someone had stolen their camping equipment while they slept. When police investigated, they found a shallow grave nearby, containing the remains of an unidentified person. Other incidents, other mysteries, all connected to Silver Lake. And the voices on Dennis's recording seem to be discussing these exact events, not as historical facts, but as personal experiences, as if the speakers had been directly involved. "I think the lake is recording confessions," Dennis told us. "I think people come out there specifically because it's isolated, because they think nobody will hear, and they confess what they did. And somehow, the lake bed, the salt, the minerals, the acoustics, somehow it records them, stores them, and plays them back randomly." One of the church members asked the obvious question, "Have you taken this to the police?" Dennis nodded. "I tried. They listened politely and suggested I was hearing radio interference or making assumptions about random sounds. They weren't interested." That night, Dennis decided to go back to Silver Lake, this time during the day, to see if the voices could be heard in sunlight or if it was a purely nighttime phenomenon. Linda begged him not to go. She had a bad feeling, she said. Something about the whole situation felt wrong. But Dennis went anyway. He left early Saturday morning, telling Linda he'd be back by afternoon. He took all his equipment, plus a video camera, to document everything visually. By sunset, he hadn't returned. Linda called his cell phone. No answer. By midnight, she called the police. They found Dennis's truck at Silver Lake, parked near the access road. All his equipment was still inside, untouched. His phone was on the dashboard, battery dead. But Dennis was gone. Search teams combed the lake bed for 3 days. No footprints beyond those leading from his truck to the center of the lake. Then nothing, as if he'd simply evaporated. No signs of struggle, no blood, no body. Dennis Kowalski vanished on August 13th, 1994, in broad daylight, from the middle of a flat, empty lake bed where you could see for miles in every direction. They never found him. But here's what Linda told me 6 months later, when she finally felt strong enough to talk about it. She went back to Silver Lake one night, not to search, but to say goodbye. She stood in the center of the dried lake, where Dennis had recorded those voices, and she waited. At midnight, she heard them again. The same overlapping conversations, the same fragmented confessions. And then, clear as day, she heard a new voice. Dennis's voice. I thought I understood what was happening here. I thought it was just acoustic phenomena, sound waves trapped in mineral deposits. But I was wrong. This place doesn't record voices. It collects them. It keeps them. And once you hear yourself speaking here, once you add your voice to the collection, you become part of it. You can't leave because you're already part of what the lake remembers. The voice cut off abruptly. Linda ran back to her car and never returned. She moved away from Fallon 3 months later. I heard from her once, briefly, in 1998. She said she still heard Dennis's voice sometimes, late at night, whispering from radios that weren't turned on, from phones with no one on the line, from the static between television channels. He's still there, she told me, still trying to warn people, still trapped in whatever that place is. I've never been to Silver Lake. I never will. But I know people who have, and some of them tell me they've heard strange things. Voices in the darkness, conversations that sound too close to be distant, confessions whispered by people who aren't there. And I wonder how many voices are trapped in that dried lake bed now. How many people stood in that exact spot, thinking they were alone, speaking secrets aloud, and became part of the permanent record that Silver Lake keeps. Dennis was wrong about one thing. The lake doesn't just record confessions, it collects souls. And once it has your voice, it never gives it back. If you made it to the end, then you sat with these stories in the dark, just like I did when they first happened. Some nightmares fade with time, but others wait quietly, like footsteps in the desert you can't see, only hear. If tonight's stories stayed with you, If they made you glance at a dark hallway or listen a little closer to the silence, press like so I know I'm not the only one who still remembers these things. And subscribe, because there are more stories I've carried for years, and I think it's finally time to tell them. And if you have a true horror story of your own, something you've seen, heard, or lived through that still doesn't make sense, you can send it to our email in the description. Maybe next time, I'll be telling your story.